First of all, I just wanted to say that about 2 weeks ago, we got to go out to San Francisco and we saw like this big display of Andor stuff, and we got to see your work up close. It's just beautiful. So first and foremost, thank you for everything that you did on Andor, for all your hard work.
That's very kind. It was definitely a labor of love, I can tell you.
But it was wild to see some of that stuff just like right in front of, I mean, on the other side of glass, but it still looked awesome. Um,
Awesome.
Well, Star Wars notoriously has a lot of rules that you need to follow for how things are made, including costumes, things like not using buttons or fasteners. So, did you know about all of that coming into Andor, or was that a surprise to you?
I think lots of people talk about the rules of Star Wars costuming, but I actually had a really pleasant experience with that, starting with dialogue with Kathleen Kennedy, who was so encouraging for me to like not worry about all that and show us the sort of my interpretation of Star Wars that was modern and fresh and surprising. So I didn't feel limited or held back at all there. That was very encouraging. But of course, I did my serious research into the 50 years of image making in the Star Wars domain, whether it's the films, the animation, the graphic novels. I really wanted to see how all of these characters and you know and worlds had been uh, shown before. It's kind of like you need to know the rules before you can think about breaking them, I think. Um, but I was right on board. I didn't really need to show buttons or zippers or anything like that. I thought that makes made sense to me. But I think we built about 9 different cultures, different planets in Andor season 2, and with each of those, it was just very specific. We made our own rules. We thought about, what are these different planets? What do they stand for? What do they in our story? What do they speak about our story? What materials do they have available then to them to make costumes and to make buildings and their environments, and what were their beliefs and their customs and their climate and anything like that that would influence the way they looked. So that's the sort of world building we did. And I feel like that sort of set us up with 9 different sets of rules for our different planets that helped us flesh out these different looks.
That's awesome. Perfect segue into my next question because I'd love to talk about some of those unique, different looks. I figured we'll start with the people of Gorman because you had to create the fashion for a culture whose primary export is fashion. So,
Exactly.
was your approach to that task any different from creating the costumes for less fashion-forward planets like Ferrix or Aldani?
I don't think it was. It was the same sort of, you know, investigation into culture and why people dress the way they do, whether it's fashion orientated or a more sort of utilitarian look. With Gorman, what I really wanted to project with the clothing is the sort of sense of classic old school European style. We looked a lot at um, Paris and Milan, especially the sort of the 40s and the 50s, 1940s and 1950s. And this sort of sense of a very proud culture. They weren't flashy or showy like the people on Coruscant. They had this quite refined, restrained look to their clothes, but they really cared about the cut, the textures, the fabrics, all of the things that I guess costume designers care about as well. So I found it very easy to jump into their shoes. But yeah, we created a palette of fabrics that we thought were sort of representative of the Gorman twill fabrics that would be produced there. And we did a whole cross section of humanity. We did workers, we did people that worked at the fabric, showrooms. We did prominent citizens. We did a look for the sort of underground resistance movement that's happening there. So it was a wonderful, huge palette of different personalities. I think we created about 500 different costumes for the different extras that we saw in Gorman. So that was really interesting. This sort of sense of humanity and sort of the apex of human culture that the Gormans represent was very important. Their pride, their sense of working together as a unit, their civic pride. It was important to me just showing their costumes because, thematically, we see all of that culture being crushed by the empire and the horrible protests and the riots in episode 8. And so this sense of like the beautiful tide of humanity being crushed by the Empire really had to be sort of expressed in their clothing and their culture. So that's what I was going for in their costuming.
I love that you also like mentioning being crushed and oppressed by the Empire. You have a character, Cyril and Cassian, who are both undercover in Gorman, but trying to fit in. So, did you do anything with their costumes to help like subtly make hints that, yeah, Cyril is here, he's dressed as a Gorman, but there's something about him that stands out?
That's a really great question. They were all trying to fit in, but in very different ways, right? Like, so you have Cassian sort of had two aliases on Gorman. He had the fashion designer that came in to sort of look for new fabrics for his collection. That was his sort of undercover alias. And to do that, we make him fit in by him looking very urban and sleek and tailored, just kind of a little bit like the Gormans themselves, but a rather more extreme version of that with his very dramatic color palettes of like a very dark sort of purple colors and crisp white shirts. It was a completely different Cassian that we've seen before, but one that made sense in this sort of fashion hub, this textile hub of Gorman. Then his second alias was a journalist, Ronnie Gooch, and he sort of bit it into Gorman, but in a completely different way. He sort of came in as a journalist that was covering the events of this protest. So I sort of thought about, you know, war journalists that go around the world here on Earth and what they might wear. So we chose very sort of comfortable layered clothing, linens and cottons and things that would work in any sort of environment. So he had this sort of foreign correspondent journalist vibe going on. It was sort of very different to his other alias. Then Cyril, yeah, you're right. He also sort of tries to blend in. He's affected by the Gorman culture, you know, and he starts off as a very straight up bureaucratic corporate imperial, you know, worker. But he's influenced by the way the elegance and the grace and the beautiful fabrics and tailoring that he sees around him, and his look changes. He gets himself some Gorman clothing, a lovely tailored jacket, a trench coat, some beautiful velvet scarves, and a beret. So he's definitely, you know, experimenting, you know, the power of expressing yourself through clothing in a very Gorman way. And I think it's sort of terrible and tragic to see this person then becoming a victim of the empire and like a sort of pawn in their greater scheme, and he actually gets crushed by the empire. And when you see him in his beautiful Gorman clothes and his great French coat with that cool sort of wingback detail that I put in, it's kind of it's I think it sort of adds to the tragedy that this person is being crushed by the empire.
Yeah, the Empire doing a lot of crushing, and Cyril's girlfriend, part of the ISB. I've been looking into just like these little details, and I saw in another interview that you did that you used three shades of white for the ISB uniforms as like a subtle hint to their rank. I
Yeah.
probably subconsciously caught that, but I don't think I ever would have been able to point it out myself. So, are there any other costuming details like that that may have flown under the radar?
I'm glad you say that because a lot of the aim of my design is to work on a sort of subliminal, you know, sort of way. I don't like to, you know, hit audiences over the head with like very strong costuming. These people are supposed to be human beings after all that are, you know, they're not two-dimensional tropes. They work in a quite a simple way. So yeah, we have the three tones of gray, white for the ISB uniforms. What other details are there? I think, you know, there's a whole world of imperial uniforming that we see in season two. There's the urban SWAT team that we see go into the safe house and take out or look for Cassian there and Claire there. So that sort of is based on sort of a version of stormtrooper armor, but it's worn over sort of combat clothing, but using the sort of the Star Wars iconography for that armor shape there. We see uniforms at the hospital. I had to create a uniform for uh, the nurses and the doctors and the hospital staff there. And I kind of referred a little bit back to my costumes at the Imperial Prison in Narkina in the first season with some of the detailing of those clothes, because I thought it'd be nice to sort of make a connection there of this sort of this very utilitarian Star Wars uniform, a hospital, a prison. There's sort of crossover there. So I sort of put in some little Easter egg links between those two costumes.
How do you go about making something like nurse scrubs, which need to, convey a real world sense so that the audience knows exactly what Clea is disguised as, but you're still trying to make it feel a little bit otherworldly, a little Star Warsy?
Hmm. I think you look at the Earth versions of that, and then in all its spectrum, whether it's in what's happening in America, what's happening in Asia, what's happening in the Middle East, what are the most I guess unusual versions of of doctors and nurses and hospital gear, what already exists in the world, and then what can you take from that and then extrapolate, minimalize, add interesting details to add those sort of Star Wars vibes to make it make sense in a place like Coruscant. It's a process, I guess, of research, then you know exploration through illustration. I work with an incredible team of illustrators, and they help sort of measure out: is this too boring? Is this too far? Does this still feel like a nurse? Have we gone too far? So it's this wonderful sort of process of exploration until we kind of hit on something that just feels to be the right balance of relatable, recognizable, but also belonging to the Star Wars universe.
I want to make sure that we touch on Mon Mothma because, I mean, your work for her costumes has just received so much praise, uh, deservedly so. So, what was it like to create all these different costumes for her to reflect the evolution of her character over these 5 years of storytelling?
Mm. It's really been one of the great pleasures of this job for me, working with Genevieve and charting the journey of her character. The thing I always talk about with her character is that it's it's striking this balance between the supreme poise and elegance of this incredibly sophisticated urbane senator, and but then also hinting at the vulnerability and the fragility of her situation. She's funneling all of her funds into the sort of fledgling rebel alliance, and by doing so, she's putting her own life, the lives of all of her loved ones and family at such incredible danger and risk. And so I wanted to sort of sense, if the mask could slip at any time and everything could be destroyed. So with her costumes, there's this sense of poise, of architecture, of very strong contemporary lines, but there's always an element that hints at the vulnerability, whether it's the flutter or the pleated silk details, whether it's the earring or the draped chain details that kind of move and tremble a little bit, whether it's the color palette that is a little, you know, sort of almost like a skin tone. I put her in lots of sort of beigey ivory tones that sort of give her this glow. There's always something that I hope hints at this dichotomy between strength and vulnerability. So we see her in her home planet for the first time in the first three episodes of um, season two, at this very elaborate 3-day wedding ceremony. She has 6 costumes there that sort of show this different, journey that she has to take as a hostess of this massive ritualistic event, culminating in the costume that she wears to the wedding itself, which I knew had to move and create in really interesting dynamic shapes for that final moment where she's lost in the dance and the music, and she wants to escape from her horrible the trap of her horrible the situation, which she sets to send one of her friends off to his death. So she's trying to lose herself, and that we knew it was the moment where this very rigid formal Chandrilan culture would sort of burst into chaos, and the music would be pumped up, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and everyone's just lost in the delirium of the fabrics. And so I was made sure that with her costume and with the costume of the 200 other wedding guest extras, that they would move beautifully. That we chose great silks and shears, and we pleated them into this really interesting shape that would sort of create this swirl of fabric and color and chaos. So that was kind of a way that hopefully costumes kind of helps signal to the audience what was going on with Mon Mothma.
I love that you point out that she had what 6 costumes over 3 episodes because some Star Wars characters wear the same outfit for years, it seems. So, as a quick closing question, I know our time is up. Are there any other Star Wars characters that you would like to create a new look for, maybe help them out with their fashion sense?
How interesting. Um, let's see. Well, there's certain characters that do wear the same thing all the time, and we had one of them, Orson Krennic. He has his iconic look. He's got his white cape, his ultra iconic villain look. We hadn't seen him on screen for about 8 years or something like that. So I thought it was important to kind of repeat the iconography of his look whenever we saw him. I did have a chance though to sort of have a little bit of fun with that when he goes to this formal event in the evening, and I wanted to create a look for the ISB that was their sort of formal dress evening uniform. So I created another version of Krennic's costume that was made out of much more satiny, creamy fabrics. He had all of the sort of regalia, the shoulder epaulets, the collar pips, the brocade, the braid, military braid across his chest, all sorts of details that sort of helped get this sort of heightened sense, another version of a iconic character. So that was interesting to play with the similar but different um, elements of Orson Krennic's costume.
Nope. Great. I know our time is up, so thank you so much for taking a little time to speak with me today, and thank you again for all your hard work on Andor. It was a wonderful series through and through.
Thank you so much, Alex. Great talking with you.